An offer of 2.5% a year for public sector workers is in any way an adequate response to an inflation rate that is running at just under 8%, means in effect the government are asking workers, pensioners, people on low and middle incomes to accept pay and income cuts and to pay for the cost of living crisis rather than ensure that wages and incomes at least match the level of inflation. That is completely unacceptable. Equally, the idea that they can't take measures now to, for example, introduce things like rent controls is completely unacceptable. I mean, the ICTU produced a report recently showing that utility and housing costs in this country are 78% higher than the European average. Now, that's not down to Ukraine or COVID or anything else. That's down to a failure of this government to deliver public and affordable housing and to control racketeering by vulture funds, corporate landlords, property investors and property speculators. So unless they address the cost of rent and accommodation, which they have the power to do, it doesn't require even a budget or a mini budget. It just requires introducing legislation. And the same goes to for controlling energy costs and heating costs for people. They have the power in the statute books under the Consumer Act to control the costs of basic heating and energy, and yet they refuse to do so. So despite all the kind of despite all the rhetoric that the government are going to deliver a cost of living budget, it seems very, very clear that this government wants working people, pensioners, those on social welfare, those on modest incomes, to pay the price for the cost of living and housing crisis rather than take the urgent and necessary measures to address that crisis. So we are going to pile on the pressure. We saw the first protests on this at the weekend, and there are going to be further protests. There's a meeting of the Cost of Living Coalition later this afternoon where we will be discussing the plans for further protests to mobilise people again, and hopefully in larger numbers to take to the streets to force this government to address the cost of living and housing crisis, because it is absolutely clear that as it stands they have no intention of in a serious way protecting people from this crisis.
Any questions
Yeah.
So when it comes to public sector pay talks, do you think the rises should be 8%? Should be an annual rate?
Yes, I think as an absolute minimum, workers have to be compensated for what is in effect an income cut that they've taken as a result of inflation. And if they aren't compensated, not only are workers effectively being asked to take a pay cut, but it's going to damage the economy because they will have less purchasing power, and that's going to hit the high street and every part of the economy. So, the suggestion that somehow giving workers pay increases that keep pace with inflation is going to produce more inflation is nonsense. If we don't give workers and pensioners and social welfare recipients at least increases to match the rising cost of living, in effect, you're asking them to take an income cut, which will in turn then damage the economy, as well as inflicting unjustified and unnecessary hardship on working people and ordinary householders. There you go now. Hop along top.
I'm going to talk briefly about the COVID situation. Obviously the numbers in hospital in particular are very worrying. 626 people in hospital at the moment with COVID, and what's most worrying with that is the rate of increase. That's almost 20% of an increase in the number of people in hospital with COVID in the course of just 1 week. So we commend the INMO for speaking out about this, for talking about the crisis that is presented in terms of our hospitals, in terms of our society, in terms of the, at least 15 people a day who continue to die as a result of COVID. And we're also striking a warning note that if action isn't taken now to get on top of the situation, to bring it back under control, well then we can face, an even worse situation in a few months' time, in particular, heading into next winter. So there are very simple measures that we think the government needs to take. In effect, the government strategy has been to say, oh, we need to live with COVID, but not do actually anything to assist us to live with COVID. They have scrapped the free antigen tests for close contacts of those who report positive with COVID. There's very little public health messaging in terms of the fact that people should be wearing masks in public transport, in indoor spaces, and nothing has been done still on the question of ventilation. It's over 6 months now since our ventilation bill passed second stage in the Dáil, unanimously passed through. The Minister taking the debate on that day, Damien English, said that he would give me a call that afternoon to discuss how it could be rapidly implemented by means of regulation. I'm still waiting for that phone call. There is no sign of progress in terms of that, when we know that those sort of measures would make a big difference in terms of transmission. So we think we need to return to a situation where people are wearing masks inside in public transport, indoor places, and the best way to do that is for the government to send out a message by sending out FFP2 or N95 masks to every household in the country, to having them available at bus stations, train stations, etc. for free, and to try to re-normalise the idea that unfortunately at this moment it makes sense for people to protect themselves and to protect each other by wearing masks and trying to get a lid on transmission. Secondly, to provide free antigen tests for anyone who wants them. We should be encouraging mass testing throughout society. And thirdly then, to pass and implement the ventilation bill to provide everybody in a workplace, including schools, the right to clean air, whether that's through ventilation or through filtration. The government actually needs to invest in those things if we're to avoid another crisis situation.
Sorry, just on two separate lines, in the Times report about these limited partnerships on Sunday, where there seems to be an awful lot of, it's very opaque, we don't know who controls these companies, and at least one of them was related to kind of a crypto scam. Thousands of companies have been the last 4 years. Is there anything the government should be doing to kind of make this, clear this up and make sure that we do know who owns these companies? It seems to be owned by Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, a whole bunch of countries.
I'm sure there should be something done. The truth is I didn't read the article, so I better go and read the article before I comment on it, if that's okay. I didn't read the Sunday Times at all. It's behind a paywall. But go.
So my second question was on the Chinese spy story that Christine Lee, the secretary, met justice officials about the immigrant investor program back in 2012, and there's an ongoing Gardaí investigation into that program overall. Is that something that would concern you, that someone who's been named as a Chinese spy by the British government was meeting justice officials about that as early as...
Again, I better go and read the article. I will read the article. You can call if you want. Sorry. From now on, I'll read the Sunday Times religiously.
Back to the start of the mask. Do you believe instead of a mask mandate, it should be a mask encouragement for you available?
I think the government is doing very little at the moment to encourage people to wear masks. And the consequence is, the truth is, the vast majority of people, and I'm not blaming them personally, but the vast majority of people have given up on mask wearing. What made people wear masks at the time, in my opinion, wasn't so much the potential fine or whatever. It was a societal thing that we were all in this together. People were wearing masks together to protect each other and so on. So we need to have a switch in terms of signalling from the government. And I think before we talk about masks mandates, we should actually have an approach of the government trying to encourage people to do it through providing them free, through a lot of public health messaging and so on. And then I'm pretty confident that will have an impact in terms of massively increasing the amount of mask wearing that's going on. But let's have a discussion then about other ways of dealing with it.